The breach alarm was already running when I stepped off the transit crawler. I had been on hetch-voran IV for 11 minutes. My intake documentation was open on my databoard. Fields half filled, the outpost commander's name spelled incorrectly because I had been writing it phonetically, and the humans do not transliterate the way the survey bureau assumes they do. Crawler's boarding ramp was still warm against my secondary footpad, and the alarm, a low two-tone pulse that I had been told in my pre-deployment briefing, was the outpost Kulna 7 signal for perimeter integrity compromised, elevated, was cycling through the compound speakers with the even, unconcerned rhythm of something that had been doing so for at least 30 seconds before anyone told me. I looked at the human standing nearest to me on the landing apron. She was a young woman in mottled gray fieldwork clothing. Not a soldier, I thought at first, because she was carrying a clipboard rather than a weapon, and because she was frowning at a piece of paper rather than at the tree line. Then I looked more carefully and saw that the clipboard was a fire control manifest, that the weapon was slung across her back in a way that suggested it lived there, and she did not think about it, and that the frown was not alarm. It was arithmetic. "Corporal Maroon," she said without looking at me. "You're the survey embed?" Senarath, survey cased, documentation and incident classification, seconded to Kalna 7 for the duration of the hetch-voran IV territorial assessment. I understand there is a... Yep, she tore the top sheet off the clipboard and tucked it into a chest pocket. Varathi Pack, Eastern Sector. They hit the wire about 40 seconds ago. We've reached Rations this rotation. This is the first daylight one. She looked at me for the first time. Her eyes were a pale gray-brown that the Survey Bureau's pre-deployment briefing had described as common among humans of the northern continental genotype, and they held the expression I would later come to think of as the standard Kalna 7 expression, a kind of flat, forward-directed alertness that was not quite calm and not quite urgency and not quite anything I had a classification for. You need to get inside Hardpoint 2. Do you know where that is? I have not yet completed my orientation walkthrough. It's the gray building, she pointed. They're all gray. It's the second one from the left. She was already moving as she said it, not running but walking at the efficient, slightly too fast pace that I would also come to recognize as the standard Kalna 7 ambulation mode during an alarm. Stay off the northern wall. Keep your head below the sandbag line if you're outside. Don't touch the wire regardless of what's on it. Then she was gone, angled toward the eastern perimeter, her boots making no particular noise on the gravel of the landing apron. I stood for a moment with my databoard open and my intake documentation half completed. The alarm continued its two-tone pulse. I went to find the gray building. My name in the full survey-cased formal rendering is Senarath Velkoshan of the 43rd Documentation House, and I have spent 31 years filing incident reports for the Bureau of Tested Margin Assessment. I say this not as a credential but as a context. I am not easily surprised by the contents of a report. I have documented Varathi territorial incursions on 14 separate survey margin worlds. I have filed the aftermath assessments for 3 full outpost evacuations, 2 of them under fire. I have written the official Bureau account of the Shenveth 4 first contact incident, which the human diplomatic delegation later described as, and I am quoting from their counterfiling, accurate but written as if describing a furniture arrangement, which I have always taken as a compliment. I am telling you this so that you understand. When I say that Outpost Kalna 7 surprised me, I am not speaking loosely. I mean it in the technical, documented, Bureau standard sense. I mean that, in 31 years of fieldwork, I encountered 18 events that required me to open a new classification category in my data board, rather than selecting from an existing one. 14 of those 18 events occurred within a 7-day span at Kalna 7. And 13 of those 14 events were caused, directly or indirectly, by Corporal Yessa Maroon. The 14th was the Rations. But I am getting ahead of myself. The Varathi are not sapient. I want to be precise about that, because the terminology matters in a Bureau classification context, and because I have seen 3 separate post-incident reports from other survey teams that used the word intelligent when they meant coordinated, and the confusion caused significant interagency paperwork. The Varathi are not intelligent. They do not use tools, Do not communicate in symbolic language. Do not build. Do not plan in any cognitive sense that the Bureau's sapience assessment framework would recognize. What they do is coordinate, and they do it with a facility that, in 31 years of survey fieldwork, I've seen matched by only 4 other non-sapient species in the Bureau's documented catalog. A Varathi pack does not decide to attack a fixed position. It does not evaluate the defenses, assess the threat, and choose a strategy. What it does is move, adjust, and probe. And the probing is so fast and so fluid and so precisely distributed across multiple vectors that it produces, from the outside, an effect that is functionally indistinguishable from planning. The distinction is important taxonomically. It is not important when one is standing inside a prefab hardpoint on the contested survey margin of hetch-voran ifoi, listening to the wire come down. The first breach on the day I arrived covered the eastern sector, as Corporal Maroon had told me. I know this from the post-incident log I was given 3 days later, because from where I was standing inside point 2 with 4 other non-combatant personnel and one young private who had been assigned to the hardpoint as a runner and who spent the first 40 minutes of the alarm reading a physical book, I could not see the eastern sector. I could hear it. The Varathi, when they breach a wire line, do not vocalize in a way that the Bureau's acoustic databases classify as warning or territorial. The sound they make is more accurately described as operational. The low, rolling, percussive sound of a large mass of large bodies moving through undergrowth in coordinated sequence, punctuated by the sharper sounds of impact and resistance and the specific, very unpleasant sound of a Varathi forelimb making contact with fabricated materials at speed. I sat on a supply crate and kept my data board open. Documentation continues during an incident. This is Bureau policy, and it is also, I have found, personally useful. There is something about the act of filing that keeps the noise outside from filling up the space where thinking should be. Is this your first time at Kalna 7? The private with the book asked me. He did not look up. Yes, I said. I arrived 11 minutes ago. 11 minutes. He turned a page. Rough timing. Is the eastern breach typical in terms of, "Oh, that's the small one," he said, still reading. They do that to test the response time. The real push usually comes from the north about 20 minutes after. Or not. Sometimes they just do the one. He turned another page. Sergeant Vellers says they're figuring us out. I think they already figured us out and they're just bored. I looked at him. He was perhaps 19 years old by human reckoning. Is to say, he was approximately 1/4 of the way through a standard human lifespan, and had the kind of face that the pre-deployment briefing's cultural section described as still forming. His book, I could see from the cover, was a history of pre-spaceflight human naval warfare, a thick one, well-worn, with a fold of paper tucked in as a marker partway through. "You're reading," I said. "Not much else to do in here." He glanced up at me. "You want something to do?" "Shh. I've got a deck of cards in my left breast pocket. I can't play with one hand and hold the book with the other. If you want to sort them by suit, that would actually be useful." I considered that. Is sorting playing cards an effective use of time during a perimeter breach? He thought about it with apparent sincerity. I mean, is anything? I opened a new subfile on my data board and began documenting this exchange. It would become, ultimately, the first of the 17 unclassified data points. At the time, I simply filed it under anomalous personnel behavior, pending review, and went back to the intake documentation I had not yet finished. The alarm continued. Northern push came 18 minutes after the eastern breach, which was close enough to the private's 20-minute estimate that I noted it in the record. By then I had finished my intake documentation, corrected the outpost commander's name, and begun a preliminary incident timeline. I had also, at the private's suggestion, sorted his playing cards into suits. He had thanked me with complete seriousness, as though this had been a material contribution to the defense of the outpost, and tucked them back in his pocket. I heard the northern wall before I understood what I was hearing. The Varathi, when they mass for a second phase breach, make a different sound than the probing sound of the first contact. The probing sound is distributed, scattered across a wide front, irregular, like rain on fabricated roofing. The second phase sound is concentrated. It builds from a low vibration that I felt in the supply crate before I heard it in the air, and it rose over the course of perhaps 3 minutes from that subsonic rumble to something that, by the time I had moved to the far wall of hardpoint 2 and placed my secondary handpad flat against the fabricated surface, feel as a continuous, unbroken pressure, not percussive, not rhythmic, just present, the way a geological force is present, the way a rockslide is present, which is to say without opinion or variation, or any acknowledgement that there is something inside the wall that, for it to stop. That's the main push, the private said. He had put his book away. He was standing with his back against the near wall, not at the window, hands loose at his sides. He was not, I noted, holding his weapon. He had his hand near it, but not on it. A posture that I would later learn humans call ready, as distinct from armed, and as distinct from alarmed, is a different physical configuration entirely. How many Varathi constitute a main push? I asked. My stylus was moving. I was not entirely conscious of it moving. Depends on the pack. The one working this sector, Sergeant Vellers calls them the Tuesday pack because they started hitting us on a Tuesday. And once he names a thing, it stays named. They run about 60 to 70 adults when they're massing, maybe 15 subadults. He paused. Some of the subadults are bigger than the adults. That's just how they grow. 60 to 70 adults. I pulled up the Bureau's Varathi threat density metrics on my data board. A standard survey bureau forward hardpoint. Fabricated wall panels, reinforced door frames. Standard issue defensive loadout for a 6-person posting was assessed as sustainable against a Varathi incursion of up to 30 adults, assuming full personnel complement, standard ammunition reserves, and no prior structural compromise to the perimeter. The wall continued to vibrate. How many personnel are currently on the northern wall, I asked. Active defense? Probably 4, Corporal Maroon, and 3 others. Sergeant Vellers is on the eastern wire still, making sure the first breach is contained. He looked at the window. They'll be okay. Corporal Maroon worked out the spacing about 2 months ago. Before her, the coverage was wrong. Too many people bunched near the main gate, not enough on the flanks. She did it with a piece of paper and a pencil. Just sat down in the mess one evening and worked out where everyone should be. Sergeant Vellers put it in as a permanent posting adjustment the next morning. Did she have prior tactical training in defensive architecture? She's a supply corporal. He said it the way someone says a thing that is both obviously true and somehow also not the point. She manages the ammunition inventory and the ration allocation and the maintenance schedule for the perimeter sensors. She does the tactics because no one told her she couldn't. I wrote this down. It joined the playing cards in my anomalous personnel behavior subfile, which was already, I noted, larger than the corresponding file from any of my previous 14 Varathi documentation deployments. I did not see Corporal Maroon again until the second hour of the assault. I know the timeline precisely because I was documenting it. The breach alarm had sounded at 1412 minutes by the outposts. Standard timekeeping. The eastern probe had been resolved by 1437. The northern push had begun at 1430. And it was 1604 minutes when the door of hardpoint 2 opened and Corporal Maroon came in. She was not hurt. I established this immediately, and with some relief, though I noted the relief as a data point. I had been at the outpost for less than 2 hours, and I was already tracking the well-being of specific personnel, which is not standard bureau procedure, and which I suspected said something about quality of those personnel that I would need to examine more carefully in the final report. There was a long scuff of dirt along her left forearm, and her hair, which she wore pulled back in a tight wrap, come slightly loose on the right side, and one of her boot laces was untied, trailing. Otherwise, she was identical to the woman who had pointed me toward the gray building. She went straight to the supply lockers at the back of hardpoint 2. I watched her open the third locker from the left, which was, see from where I was sitting, the ration storage. She counted. She did it with the quiet efficiency of someone who counts things often and does not need to think about the counting. Her finger moved along the rows, her lips moved slightly, and after perhaps 40 seconds she stopped and looked at her clipboard. Outside, the northern wall was still under active assault. I could hear the impact intervals. The Varathi had shifted to a ram and withdraw pattern, the Bureau's tactical notes described as typical of a second phase push, once the initial massed charge had failed to breach, and which meant they were not leaving. The two-tone alarm was still cycling. Through the hardpoint's single narrow window I could see the orange-yellow light of a standard hetch-voran IV mid-afternoon. The system's sun sitting, perhaps 40 degrees above the tree line, warm and specific and completely indifferent to the events below it. 14 rations, Corporal Maroon said. She said it to her clipboard, not to me. We'll need more by Thursday. I stopped writing. I reviewed what I had just heard. My databoard's audio capture function had recorded it, and I could see the transcription appearing in real time in my documentation log. 14 rations. We'll need more by Thursday. The timestamp reads 1604 minutes. The ambient audio track clearly registered, behind the words, the continued impact of Varathi bodies against the northern wall. I did not, at that moment, have a classification category for what I had just heard. This is not something I say often. In 31 years of fieldwork, across 57 survey margin deployments, I had encountered perhaps 6 instances of data that genuinely resisted the Bureau's standard taxonomic framework. The framework is comprehensive. It covers threat assessment, personnel response, structural documentation, biological cataloging, and 7 subcategories of what the Bureau terms anomalous sapient behavior, which is itself a broad enough category that it has swallowed a great many things that, on reflection, were not actually anomalous so much as unfamiliar. I am not a person who opens new classification categories easily. My documentation chief, San Vel Asarath, once told a junior archivist that if Sen Arath cannot classify it, then it genuinely cannot be classified, which was, I suspect, more a statement about my stubbornness than about my skill. I could not classify what Corporal Maroon had just said. The words were perfectly clear. 14 rations, more by Thursday. A logistical inventory conducted during an active perimeter assault. The words were not unusual. The words were, in fact, the most ordinary sequence of words I had heard since stepping off the transit crawler. That was the problem. The Bureau's standard sapient stress response taxonomy has 9 categories, ranging from Category 1, active combat engagement, high cognitive load, reduced verbal output, to Category 9, full dissociative withdrawal, no verbal output, requires external intervention. Across all 9 categories, across every sapient species the Bureau has documented in the full 300 years of its survey record, there is one consistent feature of the stress response architecture: threat salience dominance. When a sapient organism is under existential threat, the threat is salient. It is present in the organism's communication, in its physical posture, in its cognitive allocation. It does not disappear. It may be suppressed, managed, overridden by training or discipline or simple stubbornness. But it remains present as the dominant context within which all other activity occurs. Corporal Maroon had just performed a routine logistical inventory. As a coping mechanism, I have documented several sapience species that use procedural activity as a psychological anchor during high-stress events, and the Bureau's taxonomy covers it under Category 4, displacement activity, functional. What Corporal Maroon had done did not fit Category 4, because Category 4 requires that the activity be recognizably secondary, that the organism's primary attention remain oriented toward the threat, with the procedural activity serving as a buffer. The displacement activity organism knows the wall is coming down. It cleans its weapon, or organizes its kit, because the cleaning and organizing give it something to do with its hands, while it knows the wall is coming down. Corporal Maroon had counted the rations. She had counted them because they needed counting. She had announced the result: 14 rations. More by Thursday, because that was the relevant logistical information, which someone in this outpost would need. And she was the person who had it, and so she said it. The northern wall was coming down in the same sensory field as the ration count. Both were present. Both were apparently data. I did not have a category for this. Corporal Maroon, I said. She looked up from her clipboard. Still here, good. She was making notes. You doing okay? I am documenting, I said. I wanted to ask, the ration assessment you just performed. We're low. We were already running tight before this rotation. And if this push goes long, we'll be down to emergency rations by day after tomorrow. She tore the top sheet off the clipboard again. Different sheet. She had apparently been through 3 sheets since arriving. I'm going to need to get a resupply request to the transit authority by tomorrow morning, regardless of how this resolves. She paused and looked at me with the pale gray-brown eyes. Are you logging that? I am logging everything, I said. Good. Log that the resupply request is time-sensitive. The transit crawler turns around in 72 AMI 2 hours, and if I miss the manifest window I'm filling, out an emergency priority requisition. And the last time I filed one of those, the regional depot sent us 14 cases of a grain-based ration paste that I've been trying to distribute since the 3rd month. She made another note. Nobody eats the paste. I don't know why they keep sending it. Requested a substitution 6 times. You've requested a substitution, I said, for the ration paste. In writing, 6 times. She said it without rancor, the way one states a bureaucratic fact that is absurd, but not surprising. The depot acknowledges the request and sends the paste anyway. I think their system auto-generates the paste. I think it's possible nobody at the depot has ever thought about the paste specifically. It just gets sent because the category is supplemental caloric units, and paste is a supplemental caloric unit, and so it goes in the box, the clipboard under her arm. Anyway, I need to get back to the wall, stay away from the north side. And she left. I sat for a long time with my data board open and my stylus motionless. The private, who had apparently been watching this exchange, said, "She does that." "Does what?" I said. "The inventory thing during a push." She says she does it because the numbers don't change during an assault. They're the same numbers they were before the alarm, and they'll be the same numbers after. And the only question is whether she counts them now or later, and later is usually more complicated. He retrieved his book from his pocket, examined the cover for a moment, and put it away again. I think she also just likes knowing what there is. I wrote this down. I wrote down everything. I opened 3 new subfiles and filled them, and then opened a 4th. I looked at what I had written, and then I looked at the subfile category header. Anomalous personnel behavior, pending review, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, the particular intellectual discomfort of a document that is filing correctly but in the wrong category. Anomalous. Was it anomalous? I pulled up the Bureau's sapient stress response taxonomy on my data board and read through all 9 categories for the 3rd time. In an hour, I read the supplementary notes. I read the cross-references. I read the citation list for the original Shenveth IV behavioral assessment, from which 3 of the 9 categories had been derived. Pulled up the operational files from my previous 14 Vorathi deployments, and searched them for any comparable incident, any instance of a documented sapient performing routine logistical assessment during an active assault, and found 11 entries, all of them tagged Category 4, displacement activity, functional, and all of them, on rereading, clearly different from what I had just observed. In every one of those 11 cases, the logistical activity was secondary. The organism was present to the threat, and using the activity as an anchor. In every one of those 11 cases, there was visible stress behavior, elevated vocalization, accelerated movement, disruption to normal procedural routine. Corporal Maroon had not been disrupted. She had performed the ration count at the same pace, the same precision that I suspected she would have used if the outpost had been entirely quiet. I created a new category. I called it, tentatively, Threat Ambient Routine Maintenance, and I knew even as I named it that the name was wrong, because it implied the threat was ambient. Background noise, wallpaper, and I did not actually believe that was what was happening. I thought what was happening was something different. I thought what was happening was that Corporal Maroon was aware of the threat with complete precision, had assessed it with whatever internal calculus she used, and had concluded that the ration count was also necessary and also possible, and therefore was being done, not despite the alarm, in addition to it. The Bureau taxonomy does not have a category for in addition to. The assault continued through the afternoon. I stayed in Hardpoint 2 and documented. The private, whose name I eventually established from the outpost personnel manifest, was Davin Orr. Assigned to Kalna 7 8 months ago from a regional training depot, listed as administrative support, which I suspected, like supply corporal, covered a broader functional reality than the job title implied. Went back to his book. He read with the focused quiet of someone for whom reading is not an escape from the present situations, but only one of several things happening in present situation. At 17, Sergeant Vellers came in. He was a large man by human standards, with a face that the Bureau's physical description framework would have categorized as weathered. The kind of face that records outdoor time in its surface, in the particular set of the eyes, and the lines at their corners, and the way the skin sits over the underlying structure as though it has been outside long enough to find the position most resistant to weather. He had a bandage on his left forearm, neat and tight, that had been applied by someone who knew what they were doing. "Embed," he said to me, "you still alive?" "I am documenting," I said. "You? Fine." He sat on a supply crate and put his weapon across his knees. The east breech is sealed. They got through the outer wire but not the secondary. We lost a sensor array on the southeast corner. I'll get Maroon to file the replacement quest. Corporal Maroon is already preparing a resupply manifest, I said. Of course she is. He said this without irony, without the slight qualifying tone that humans sometimes use when acknowledging a colleague's competence in a way that implies the acknowledgement is, itself, a small cost. He said it the way one says, of course the sun rose, a fact and a feature of the world, in their natural category. What's the manifest say? 14 rations remaining. She anticipates needing resupply by Thursday. Right, he nodded. She'll have the request in by morning. She'll get it wrong on purpose. I looked at him. Not wrong, he said. She'll order more than we actually need, because the depot has a percentage allocation they apply to all resupply requests. Shaves off roughly 12%. She accounts for it in the original order. Has for 6 months. He looked at me with the same flat-forward alertness I had seen in Maroon, though in him it sat slightly differently. More settled, I thought. The alertness of someone who has been alert for long enough that it has become the resting state. You're writing that down. I am writing everything down. Good. Write this down, too. He reached into a chest pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, which he held out to me. I took it. It was a hand-drawn diagram, pencil on standard issue field paper, and it showed the outpost from above, the wall perimeter, the hard points, the gate positions, with small notations at regular intervals along the walls. That's Maroon's original coverage diagram. From about 2 months ago. You can see where she found the spacing gaps. I examined it. The diagram was precise. Not technically precise in the way a Bureau cartographic document is precise. It lacked scale indicators. Portions were slightly distorted in places. And the notation system was entirely personal, using a symbol set that was not standardized, but was internally consistent. But the underlying geometric insight was immediately clear. The original posting pattern had been clustering response capacity near the high visibility entry points, and leaving the wall flanks with inadequate coverage, and the corrections Maroon had marked redistributed the capacity in a way that a Bureau tactical assessment would have arrived at through a 2-day formal process. She had done it one evening, with a pencil, because she was also apparently thinking about that. How long has she been at Kalna 7? I asked. 14 months. Sergeant Vellers accepted the paper back and refolded it. She came in as a supply clerk, straight out of basic, no field experience, no prior posting. Looked at the paper for a moment before pocketing it. First week she was here, she reorganized the ammunition storage, because the previous layout had everything sorted by weapon type instead of by frequency of use. And she said that, in an emergency, you want your most used rounds at the front, not your most organized rounds. He put the paper away. She was right. I let her do it. Week 3 she told me the sensor array on the south wall had a coverage gap, which it did, and I hadn't caught it. And I've been running perimeters for 12 years. He said this last part without embarrassment. Another fact, in its category. Does she know she's doing this? I asked. The tactical analysis. The coverage planning. I asked her that once. He stood, picked up his weapon. She said she just notices when things don't add up. She said she can't not notice. He moved toward the door. She's got a head full of numbers. Always has, I think. She just applied it here because here was where she was. He left. The alarm continued its 2-tone cycle. At 1840, The Varathi began withdrawing. I know the precise time because I had been tracking the assault in real time in my incident log, but the withdrawal did not announce itself. There was no clear moment at which the wall stopped vibrating. What there was a gradual reduction in the pressure of the sound, a slow thinning of the impact intervals, from continuous to frequent to irregular, and then a period of perhaps 20 minutes, during which the outpost was alert and still, every human I could see through the hardpoint window, moving carefully along the walls with the precise, deliberate posture of people who know that a withdrawal can reverse. And then the alarm stopped. The silence that followed a Varathi assault alarm, I would later write in my official incident report, is not actually silence. The outpost continues to produce noise. Personnel continue to move and speak. The ambient sounds of hetch-voran V's evening ecology resume around the perimeter, but it has the quality of silence in the sense that it is the absence of the particular pressure that the alarm represents. And the human personnel, I observed, responded to it with a distinct and unified physical release that the Bureau's documentation framework technically categorized as stress response resolution, but which looked, from the outside, more like putting down something heavy. Not Corporal Maroon. She came into Hardpoint 2 at 1910, went directly to the ration locker, and counted again. I watched her. She was more thorough this time. She opened the second and third rows of the storage rack, cross-checked against her clipboard, made 2 annotations. When she was done, she closed the locker and looked at her manifest. "We used 1 ration during the push," she said to the room in general. "Devan told you not to eat during an alarm." "I was hungry," said Private Orr from behind his book. "You were hungry." She wrote something on her clipboard. 13 rations. "I'm still filing for the Thursday resupply. Now I'm going to add a standing request for better snack allocation, because clearly we have a structural problem." "The paste," said Orr. "Paste is not a snack. The paste is a punishment." She tucked the clipboard under her arm. "Sen Arith." I looked up from my data board. "Intake documentation. I assume you didn't finish it when the alarm went." "I finished it," I said. "During the first phase, the eastern breach." She looked at me for a moment with the flat gray-brown eyes. "You finished your intake documentation during the eastern breach." There was time. There was. She stopped. She made a very small gesture with her chin, not quite a nod, that I had learned in the course of the afternoon, indicated CT something between acknowledgement and reassessment. "Okay. I'll need a copy for the outpost records. Regs require it by end of day. Can you transmit to the hardpoint server?" "I can, yes." "Good." She turned toward the door, then paused. "The 14 rations, I should tell you, that number is before the 12% depot cut. I already accounted for it. The actual order I'll file tomorrow morning is for 16.3 units, which rounds to 17, is what we'll get." I wrote this down. "And the paste?" I said. She turned and looked at me. Her face, for the first time since I had arrived, shifted into something that I would have classified as the beginning of a smile, except that it stopped before becoming one. It remained in the territory between a fact and an expression, partway across. "I stopped accounting for the paste 4 months ago," she said. "I let them send it. I started building a secondary storage wall with the cases on the east side of the yard. It's structurally sound. I checked the load-bearing specs." She held my gaze for a moment. "It's also excellent cover. 8 cases high, 6 wide, filled with paste. The Varathi don't know what it is. They don't go near it." She left. I sat with my stylus over my databoard for a long time. Then I opened a 5th subfile and titled it, for some deliberation, Adaptive Resource Utilization, Passive Fortification, Paste. Before I left Hardpoint 2 that evening, I counted the subfiles. 16 data points, 11 of them maroon, the rest distributed among the other personnel and the structure of the outpost itself. I reviewed the category headings. I revised 3 of them, deleted 1, merged 2 others that I had initially separated on a distinction that, on reflection, was not actually a distinction. I noted that the process of revising my own category headings felt, in a small way, like the process I was attempting to document, that the categories themselves had to stay in the field, available and revisable, rather than being closed and filed and treated as settled. I was not sure the Bureau would appreciate this observation. The Bureau generally prefers settled categories. It has been running on settled categories for 300 years, and has not found this approach, obviously, deficient, which is the institutional equivalent of a working argument. I made a note to return to the question later and closed the subfile. Sergeant Vellers knocked and came in at 1950 to check the head count. He moved through the room with the efficient informality of someone performing a routine he could do in his sleep. Paused at each account, counted, made a notation. He stopped when he reached me. "You're not sleeping," he said. "I'm documenting. You're documenting." He looked at my data board. "What are you documenting right now specifically?" "The process by which I am revising my category headings in response to observed data." I paused. "And whether that process is itself an instance of the phenomenon I am attempting to categorize." He looked at me for a long moment with the flat, settled alertness. "Is that going in the report? Possibly as a footnote." He looked at the window. "Get some sleep. We'll likely get a probe at 0300. They sometimes send 2 or 3 individuals to test the wire before the main pack moves. Quieter than a breach alarm, but it'll wake you." He moved toward the door. "Also, Maroons says to tell you that the mess hall has a functional node on the east table if you want to document in there. Better light." She anticipated I would not sleep. She anticipates most things. He went out. I did sleep briefly, and I was woken at 0247 by the specific sound of the sensor array alerting on the eastern wire. Not the full breach alarm, a lower tone, 2 short pulses, that the outpost posted signals guide described as peripheral activity, monitoring only. I lay on the cot and listened to 3 sets of boots cross the gravel outside in the dark, moving east, calm and quick. There were no voices. After perhaps 20 minutes, the boots came back. The alert tone silenced. I heard one low word exchanged between 2 personnel, too quiet for the audio capture to resolve, and then the outpost was still again. In the morning, I asked Sergeant Vellers what the probe had looked like. He said 3 subadult Varathi. Testing the secondary wire, true when the response team presented at the perimeter. He said Maroon had been first to the wire. I asked what she had done. He said she had stood at the wire line for about 90 seconds, in the dark, and then come back in and made a note in her sensor log. I asked what the note said. He produced his handset and read it to me. It said, 0248 subadult probe, Eastern Secondary, individuals. Response time 4 minutes 11 seconds. Target, under 4 minutes. Recommend modifying 0200 post-change timing by 15 minutes to allow faster East Sector response. Will adjust draft schedule tonight. I wrote this down, the 17th data point. The night was quiet after that. The Varathi, in my experience and in the Bureau's documented case history, do not typically resume a massed assault within 18 hours of a failed push. The pack requires resynchronization time, and the Tuesday pack had been working this sector for long enough that their rhythm was, by Sergeant Vellers' account, reasonably predictable. I took a cot in the general quarters building and slept for 4 hours and then woke and lay in the dark and reviewed my subfiles. I had by that point 16 unclassified data points. 12 of them were Corporal Maroon. The other 4 were Private Orr's reading practice, which I had re-examined and was no longer confident belonged in anomalous personnel behavior. On reflection, there was nothing anomalous about reading, and the category name implied a deviation from a norm that I was no longer certain I had correctly identified. The structural wall of ration paste cases, which I had filed under adaptive resource utilization, but which re-examined, felt like it belonged somewhere more precise. I did not have the more precise somewhere. Sergeant Vellers' flat matter-of-fact acknowledgement of his own prior error regarding the sensor array, which did not fit any of the Bureau's sapient self-assessment subcategories because all of them involved either defensiveness or its theatrical opposite, performative self-deprecation, and Vellers had simply stated the error the way he would have stated the position of the eastern wire. And the 12% depot cut, which Corporal Maroon had apparently been accounting for long enough that it had been incorporated into her arithmetic, the way that a fixed, physical, constant gets incorporated into an equation, not as a correction or a workaround, but as a coefficient. I lay in the dark and thought about coefficients. The Bureau's standard operating framework for contested margin assessment assumes, as its baseline, that the entities being assessed behave in accordance with their documented stress response architecture. The framework was built on that assumption across 300 years of survey data, and it works. I have used it successfully across 47 deployments. The assumption is not wrong. It is incomplete. What the framework assumes specifically is that the stress response architecture is the container, that under sufficient threat becomes the dominant context and everything else is reclassified by the organism as secondary. Assessment, planning, logistics, problem solving, all of it becomes secondary. The organism manages the threat first. The ration count happens after. What I had seen over the course of one afternoon at Colna 7 was something else. What I had seen was an organism for whom the threat and the ration count and the tactical coverage diagram and the 12% depot coefficient and the structural load-bearing capacity of stacked ration-paced cases existed in the same cognitive space simultaneously, none of them secondary, all of them present and attended to, the same way that a human eye moves between the near and the far in a visual field without declaring one of them the real thing and the other one the background. The threat was not the container. The threat was one of the contents. I did not know what the container was. I lay there for another hour, in the dark, with the quiet sounds of hetch-voran IV's night ecology moving through the walls of the quarters building, and I could not identify the container. Eventually I got up and went to the mess hall, because I was not going to sleep, and because the mess hall had a small table with good light and a power node for the data board. Corporal Maroon was already there. She was at the same table, her clipboard open, a cup of something warm beside her hand. She was not startled by my arrival. She looked up, assessed, turned to what she was writing. "Can't sleep," she said. "I'm reviewing documentation." I sat across the table. "You? Resupply manifest. I like to do it at night. Fewer interruptions." She wrote something, crossed it out, wrote it again. "Also, I think better when it's quiet. The manifest for Thursday. And the supplementary request. I'm trying to word the snack allocation in a way that doesn't make it sound like I'm complaining about the paste. Because if the depot thinks I'm complaining about the paste, they'll send more paste as a demonstration of commitment to their inventory decisions." She looked up briefly. "Have you encountered this in your fieldwork? The institutional thing where acknowledging a problem makes the problem worse, because the acknowledgement gets logged as a preference for the problem's resolution rather than the problem's elimination?" I thought about this. "I have encountered the equivalent at the bureau," I said. "Yes, it's very common," she said. "The solution is to frame the resupply as a capacity expansion rather than a substitution request. You're not asking them to stop sending paste. You're asking them to expand the category." She made another annotation. "Then, when the paste inevitably arrives anyway, you have a documented case for storage allocation. You've thought about this a great deal. I've been fighting this paste problem for 4 months. She looked at the clipboard. 4 months is a long time to think about paste. I found, to my own surprise, that I was smiling, not in the partial way, all the way, the expression completing itself. "Corporal Maroon," I said. "Yeah. During the assault today when you were in Hardpoint 2 and you counted the rations." 14, she said. "Well, 13 now. Davin. Teen, yes. When you said that with the assault still running on the northern wall, were you?" I paused, trying to formulate the question in terms that the Bureau's documentation framework would recognize as a valid inquiry prompt. "Were you aware of the assault?" She looked at me. There was a long pause. "Of course I was aware of the assault," she said. "I mean to say, was it present to you as the primary?" "The assault was happening," she said. "The rations were also a problem. Things were true." She turned back to her clipboard. "I can't do anything useful about 60 Varathi through a fabricated wall. I can count rations." So I counted rations. She wrote something. Is that my date board? I looked at the 16 subfiles, the 17 pending reclassifications, the new category headings I had been generating and revising, and generating again since 14:30 that afternoon. In my experience, I said yes, she considered this. She did not look particularly troubled by it, particularly flattered. She absorbed it in the same way she had absorbed the ration count and the depot cut and the paste problem, was to say she absorbed it as information, placed it in whatever internal architecture she used for information, and went on. Huh, she said. She wrote another line on the manifest. I've always been like that. My mother said, I used to do arithmetic in my head during thunderstorms when I was small. She said I'd sit at the window watching the lightning and counting seconds between the flash and the sound, and then I'd tell her how far away the storm was, and then I'd go back to whatever book I was reading. That is a very precise memory, I said. She told it to me often. She thought it was funny. She paused. I thought it was just. The storm wasn't going anywhere. The book wasn't going anywhere. The distance calculation was interesting, so I did it. She set the pen down and picked up the cup, both hands around it. I think that's just how some people are. Most people, when something scary is happening, they have to put everything else down and just look at the scary thing. I don't have to put everything else down. She searched for the word. Also look at the scary thing. I wrote this down. Then I wrote it down again in a new subfile, titled it differently, not anomalous, displacement, not adaptive, and sat with the cursor blinking. The 17th data point, I had been trying to categorize it as a behavior, a stress response variant, a tactical adaptation, a coping mechanism, an anomaly. I had been looking at it through the Bureau's framework for sapient responses to threat, which is a framework built around the assumption that the threat changes the sapient, that it reconfigures the organism's cognitive hierarchy, elevates certain processes, suppresses others, makes the scary thing the primary thing. What Corporal Maroon had just described was not a variant. It was not an adaptation or a mechanism or an anomaly. It was an architecture. The storms and the books and the rationed counts and the coverage diagrams and the paste wall and the 12% depot coefficient, they were not separate things she was doing despite the threat or in addition to the threat. They were the same thing, the same cognitive operation applied to different inputs. The architecture was parallel processing, the maintenance of multiple simultaneous problem states in full active attention, none of them degrading the others. The threatening one, not acquiring override status, simply by virtue of being the most threatening. It was not that the scary thing was background. It was not that the scary thing was foreground. It was that the architecture she was operating with did not have a foreground, exactly. It had a field, and everything in the field was in focus. The Bureau taxonomy had nothing for this. The Bureau taxonomy was built around the assumption that sapient cognition was fundamentally serial, that the organism could be handling one dominant thing or managing multiple things with divided attention, but that the dominant thing and the managed things were distinguishable, and that the presence of a serious threat would sort the dominant and the managed categories sharply. What I was looking at was a species, at least an instance of a species, for which that sorting did not occur, for which the threat entered the field, and was present there, fully, alongside the ration count, and the paste problem and the depot coefficient, and none of them displaced the others because displacement was not the architecture. I need to revise my category headings, I said. Corporal Maroon looked up. For me, for humans, I said. Potentially. She looked at me with the gray-brown eyes. That's a big revision. Yes, I said. She looked back at her manifest. I hope it goes better than the paste substitution request. I wrote this down too. The resupply request went out at 0700 the following morning, worded as Corporal Maroon had planned, as a expansion rather than a substitution. I know because I was in the communications room when she filed it, because I had asked to observe and she had shrugged and said, suit yourself, in the tone that I had come to understand as Kalna 7. For of course, come ahead. She filed 16.3 units, rounded to 17, as she had said she would. She filed the supplementary snack category expansion with a supporting corporate appendix that I read over her shoulder, and that was, to my documentary eye, a small masterpiece of institutional framing. It did not mention paste once. It cited 3 Bureau nutritional guidelines by registration number, and it included a projected morale efficiency correlation that was technically speculative but supported by a footnote, citing an actual study whose findings she had located, apparently, during the 4 months she had been thinking about paste. Will it work? I asked. Probably not this request, she said. But the depot will have it on file. In 2 or 3 resupply cycles they'll have it on file 3 times. triggers a regional review. She sent the manifest. I'll get there. I filed my morning documentation and then walked the perimeter with Sergeant Vellers. The Tuesday pack had withdrawn entirely. The Bureau's tracking data showed them moving south, which Vellers was consistent with their post-assault pattern, and he expected them back in 4 to 6 days. He showed me the eastern breach point, where a work team had already begun repairing the outer wire, and the paste wall on the east side of the yard, which I examined with some care. It was, as Marin had said, structurally sound. Cases were stacked with an offset brick pattern that I recognized from Bureau construction documentation as a standard load-bearing configuration. The southern face of the wall was smooth and regular. Grass had grown up against the base. "How long has this been here?" I asked. "She started it about 3 months ago," Vellers said. "First I knew about it, she'd already got the first 2 courses up. I asked her what she was doing. She said she was using available materials." He considered the wall. "I didn't tell her to stop, 'cause it was useful, because she was right." He put a hand on the top case. "Thermal mass, structural barrier, and it keeps the paste out of the storage manifest, so I don't have to look at it on inventory." He paused. "She's already filed a request to add a roof section. Says if she can cover the top, she can use it for shade in summer and the Varathi still won't go near it." "What does ration paste smell like to a Varathi?" "We don't know, but they don't go near it." He took his hand off the case. "Maroon has a theory that it smells like something they don't have a threat category for, so they apply maximum caution by default. She said it's the same reason humans don't eat bright orange berries in an unfamiliar forest. Not because they know it's poisonous, because they don't know it isn't." I wrote this down. Then I looked at the paste wall for a long time. A supply corporal at a remote outpost, assessing a chronic institutional frustration. The wrong consumable arriving repeatedly regardless of documented requests for correction, had not discarded the frustration, had not escalated it through official channels as a complaint, had not simply absorbed it as a cost of the posting. She had placed it in the field alongside everything else, and it had stayed there, active and attended to, and over the course of 4 months she had produced a filing strategy for the substitution request, current operational value, pending, 3-cycle institutional lobbying approach, projected value, eventual resolution, and a passive fortification element using the surplus material, current operational value, documented, measurable, standing, out of paste. I stood in the bright mid-morning light of hetch-voran IV, and I thought about the Bureau's standard operating framework for contested margin assessment and the taxonomy and the 9 categories of stress response, and the assumption that I had been operating under for 31 years. The assumption that the threat is the container. And I thought about Corporal Maroon at the ration and locker with her clipboard, and the pale gray-brown eyes, and the flat, forward, present alertness that was not the alertness of someone managing a threat, but the alertness of someone for whom everything in field is in focus all at once, all the time. 14 rations. We'll need more by Thursday. It was not a failure to register the threat. It was a refusal to allow the threat to reduce the field. I filed my preliminary incident report 4 days after the Tuesday pack's second assault, which came on schedule and was shorter than the first, 45 minutes eastern and northern simultaneously, withdrawn without a breach. By then, I had 23 unclassified data points. I filed the preliminary with a note that the standard taxonomy was insufficient for full classification and that I was requesting a framework review panel, which is not a procedure I have invoked in 31 years of fieldwork, and which my documentation chief, Veth-San Vel Osarath, responded to with a message that said, in its entirety, "Senarath, what happened to you? What happened to me was Kalna 7. What happened to me, specifically, was 14 rations, more by Thursday." The full report ran to 212 pages and was submitted 8 weeks after my posting ended. It argued, on the basis of my documented observations, that the Bureau's stress response taxonomy was built on a cognitively serial model that did not adequately describe the human stress response architecture, which was better characterized as a parallel processing field model, and that this had significant implications for the Bureau's standard threat assessment methodology, its personnel evaluation frameworks, and its mission planning procedures for human-partnered survey operations. It cited 47 observed instances of field parallel cognition, paste wall, the coverage diagram, the depot coefficient, and private oars reading practice. It was reviewed by a panel of 7 documentation chiefs. 3 of them recommended immediate adoption of the revised framework. 3 recommended a further study period of no less than 2 survey cycles. One wrote, in his dissenting annotation, that the entire report appeared to be founded on a single corporal's approach to ration management, and that if the Bureau were to revise its fundamental taxonomy every time a human supply clerk did something unexpected, they would be revising the taxonomy continuously. He appeared to mean as a criticism. I read his annotation twice. Then I requested a copy of his posting record and reviewed it. He had completed 6 survey margin deployments. None of them had included a human partner posting of more than 3 weeks. I wrote a response that was by Bureau standards, unusually direct. I pointed out that continuous revision in response to observed data was not a weakness of the framework, but its operational mission, and that the reason the Bureau's taxonomy had remained credible for 300 years was precisely because its architects had been willing to open new categories. When the field produced data that did not fit the existing ones, the panel adopted the revised framework on a provisional basis, pending the 2-cycle study period. Corporal Maroon was not informed of any of this. She was, to the best of my knowledge, filing resupply manifests and thinking about paste. I did write to her once, after the report was submitted, to notify her that she had been cited as the primary case study for a proposed revision to the Bureau's standard sapient stress response taxonomy, and to ask if she had any objection. She replied within the hour. The message said, "I don't mind. Can you also mention in the report that the depot keeps sending the paste?" I've attached the 6 substitution requests as supporting documentation. I added a footnote. I cited all 6 requests by reference number. I noted that as of the date of submission, no substitution had been received, and that the surplus paste had been incorporated into a passive fortification structure of documented tactical value, and that the structure was now 8 cases high, 6 wide, and currently under a partially completed roof section. Then I sat for a moment in my documentation office, with the report open on the data board and the cursor blinking at the end of the footnote, and I thought about what Corporal Maroon had said on that first night in the mess hall. The storm wasn't going anywhere, book wasn't going anywhere, so I did both. In 30 years of fieldwork, I had never revised a major taxonomy category. In 31 years, I had filed 216 incident reports, 47 deployment assessments, and 1 first contact documentation that the human delegation had called accurate but written, as if describing a furniture arrangement. I thought about that too. I added a second footnote. It was shorter than the first. It said, "The human parallel processing field architecture is not merely a tactical resource. It is a cognitive orientation toward the world that treats the threatening and the mundane as equally real, simultaneously present, equally worthy of attention. The ration count during an assault is not a coping mechanism. It is an expression of a fundamental position that the world does not reduce to its emergencies." I submitted the report. Then I went to my office window, looked out over the Survey Bureau campus grounds, a managed green space, fountain at the center, a path that 3 of my colleagues were currently walking along in the late afternoon light. And I stood there for a few minutes, not documenting anything, just looking. 13 rations. We'll need more by Thursday. I still didn't have a single category that fully held it. After all the footnotes and frameworks and revised taxonomy subfiles, I still didn't have one category. But I had come to think that was the point. The 6 teams, the non-E as the assault and the paste wall and the depot coefficient and the thunderstorm arithmetic. Field was the thing, not any one item in it. You couldn't classify the field with a single item's taxonomy. You had to account for the whole of it. Every datum, every problem, every stuck substitution request, and every structural paste wall. All of it. Present. All of it attended to. None of it dismissed because something louder was also in the room. That, I had come to believe, was the container. The threat, not the calm, not the plan, the field.